Hello friends, we have seen three topics so far now. What is literature, what is life, what is the relationship between literature and life, and now with this lecture we will look at the ways in which we can approach the topic literature and life. In this presentation we will look at some of these topics: biographical approach, composition and publication of the writings that we have, the contextual details in which those writings were written, a method of reading called close reading. When we read literature, we will see the literary form, theme, character, language and style, and literary devices that we find in the piece of writing. We will also look at the human relationships and reflections on life that we can get from this piece of writing that we study. We will also try, this may not be easily possible for us to do it in all cases, but as a reader I would suggest that you can respond to the text personally and also analyze yourself. Then we will suggest a comparative approach, comparing this text with another text by the same author or by a different author. And another one, it is good to adopt a critical approach to understand literature, but then this is being a general course for all kinds of readers. We will not focus too much on this. This is an attempt to draw your attention to how we can approach literature. Finally, we will think about certain ideas which we can take away with us to reflect on our own life, to live our life, and then we will finally give you a summary as we do at all times in all lectures. To put these ideas in the form of objectives, let's see them one after another. First objective is to discuss the possible approaches to the study of the relationship between literature and life. Next, to provide a brief account of the biographical approach, by which we will learn about the life of the author and the writings of the author. Then to deal with details of composition and publication, and then to consider close reading, a method of study of texts. Next, to examine the form, character, theme and language. Then to explore human relationships and reflection on life. Then to undertake comparisons with other similar texts by the same author or by different authors. Further, to suggest suitable critical approaches to the study of literary texts wherever possible, and finally to give possible takeaways from the text that we study in this course. What is this biographical approach? This is all about the biography of the author. We will begin by giving a picture of the author. We will provide details of the date and place of birth, education, training and career, the family of the author, and some influences, particularly reading or real life influences on the author. The basic premise is, we have this idea from Deleuze, who says all literature is mommy, daddy and kid story. So the writer belongs to a family, and all the details of the family will be really useful in most cases, even where some writers say their writing is objective and it has nothing to do with them. We will also look at some motivation for writing particular pieces of writing, the author's associations and friends. Most importantly, we will use this as a specific characteristic. We will try to give a quotation from each author for every text that we discuss. For example, here we have one from Samuel Johnson. On quotation, he says, "Quotation is the highest compliment you can pay an author." As part of this biographical approach, we will also list other writings by the same authors, because authors may have written several other works. They may have written in different genre as well, not necessarily literature, not necessarily one art form. They may have participated in several media like film, painting and many other ways of expressing themselves. This will be useful for us to compare one text with another. Actually, we can get better understanding of authors if we read more of their works in different forms of their own writing. Here we have a quotation from Ralph Waldo Emerson, who says, "Every man is a quotation from his ancestors." That means we inherit ideas from our ancestors. We are our own forefathers. We are our future children. Next, we will consider the date of composition. Sometimes some revisions may have happened, and then some writings may have translations. and the year in which the writings are published. We will look at all these details wherever possible, because the same book may have been published from different locations with even different titles. We have an example in the case of Bapsi Sidhwa's novel Ice Candy Man, which was published in 1988 in England, but later when it was published in the US and India, it was given a different title like Cracking India in 1991 and in 1992 respectively. Sometimes some pieces of writings are grouped, compiled in some anthologies, and this process of anthology making contributes to making the canon of literature. So one piece of writing becomes or achieves a classic status. We have an example in the case of Anjana Appachana's short story Sharmaji, which was published in 1991. It has been published in many anthologies and it has become a classic short story for us. Something more about the author we can find from the larger context. For example, The Wasteland has several contexts, immediate and personal context. In the case of T.S. Eliot's own failed marriage with his first wife Vivian Hayward, and his friendship with Eliot and Pound is important for us to understand how this poem The Wasteland was written. We can also look at the larger context of modernism from W.B. Yeats as well, and further we can see the socio-historical political context in the form of the First World War in which The Wasteland was written. We can also consider economic context in the example of John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. Because of this Great Depression of 1929, this novel 10 years later came into existence. One of the major methods of reading literature is called close reading. This is a method of reading introduced by the new critics in the early 20th century. They consider the text without reference to the word or anything else. For them, the words on the page were important. They paid close attention to the words, sentences, images, repetitions in a piece of writing. For example, I.A. Richards conducted an experiment with the students and published a book called Practical Criticism, where he did not mention the names of the authors and gave poems to students to interpret them, and found that without the names of the authors, students had different understanding of poetry. And then we have many other writers like William Emerson, Clark Brooks. They have come out with several ways of reading literature, paying close attention. Some of the writings are Emerson's 7 Types of Ambiguity, Clark Brooks and Robert Penn Warren's classic textbook called Understanding Poetry, and then we have another famous writing of Clark Brooks. This is called The Well-Wrought Urn. One can understand close reading better by reading some of these books or even some of the chapters in these books. In reaction to this close reading, we have a notion called distant reading by one critic called Franco Moretti. In spite of this distant reading, in spite of all other considerations like society, politics and everything, close reading has stayed with us, and it is considered to be one of the greatest tools for understanding literature. When we read literature, we have to understand the literary form. We call it genre. Every piece of writing may be part of a genre that we have to understand. We have listed 5 major forms like prose, poetry, drama, novel, short story, and within this prose and poetry we have various kinds. So for example, essay is a form of prose. We may have a reflective essay, descriptive essay or an argumentative essay. When it comes to poetry, we may have a sonnet, ode, elegy or villanelle. Sonnet with 14 lines, villanelle with 19 lines. Fixed form we may have in poetry or in other forms as well. So when we read a piece of writing, we have to place it, we have to understand the literary form as well. When it comes to drama, we have certain kinds like comedy, tragedy, or combining these two together, tragicomedy, or by using this act and scene division, we can say 5-act play or 1-act play. We can consider such characteristics when we discuss drama. When it comes to novel, we can look at the modes of writing like realist, naturalist, modernist and postmodernist. All these categories are applicable to short story as well. When we read novels, plays, short stories, we focus on the character and the situation which contribute to the theme of the piece of writing that we discuss. The character in a story, in a novel, in a drama is important for us. Major characters or minor characters, it is the characters which carry the tale for us. Literature tells us stories around some characters. More or less the form also depends on the kinds of characters we have in the novel or the play. Sometimes the author's own voice may be found in an essay form, in a short story as well. A speaker or a persona may appear in a poem. In the case of drama, only through the characters the author can speak. The characters themselves speak. So this is important for writers to understand, or readers to understand the difference between one form and another. When we discuss a novel or a short story, we always think about a narrator and the characters presented in the novel or the short story. The thoughts of these characters, the feelings, actions, motives, relationships, attitudes, behaviors, the language that they use, their appearance and the dress, all these things are important for us when we discuss a character in a novel, in a short story or a drama, or even in a poem, particularly a narrative poem where we may have certain characters. Every piece of writing has a central idea or a subject matter of the text, that's called the theme. This theme is developed through the main character or situation and language used by the author. Sometimes the themes may be explicit or implicit, that means we can easily notice them through the title, or sometimes we have to understand the theme of the story by reading the story closely. We have some examples here from Shakespeare's Macbeth and other writers. The theme of vaulting ambition is what we find in Shakespeare's Macbeth. Similarly, we find the theme of friendship in a poem, Sonnet 18 by Shakespeare. The greatest epic in English is called Paradise Lost. The author mentioned that justifying the ways of God to men is a theme of the Paradise Lost. We may have the journey or spiritual quest in a novel like Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, or a short story like The Third Bank of the River by Josa. We have the greatest theme in literature, love, which we find in Gabriel Marquez's novel Love in the Time of Cholera. Cholera or war or peace, doesn't matter. Love is a theme which is common in all literary texts, in all societies. Then we will consider language, and associated with language is the style of the author. Every writer is obliged to create his or her own language, says Marcel Proust in a letter to Madame Emile Strauss in 1908, because language is the stuff of all literature. A writer's individuality comes through the choice of words, phrases, sentence structures, or even the imagery and tone that the author uses in his or her writing. That's how writers develop a distinct style of their own. They may use, for example, and continuously or often in their writing, that is called polysyndeton, which is interesting in the case of Ernest Hemingway's novels. We find an interesting case of the use of colon in the poet A.R. Ammons, and similarly dashes in Emily Dickinson. Some writers like E. Cummings are known for their use of lowercase in their writings, that is small letters. They don't use capital at all. One of the reasons is they want to democratize language or literature. Sometimes we may find the dominance of scientific vocabulary in some writers like John Donne. And when we come to Indian literature, we find that R.K. Narayan, when he started writing, he started using English along with Indian words, and that's why when we read R.K. Narayan's stories, we find that we are able to relate to R.K. Narayan much more easily. Whenever we read any piece of literature, one of the things that we are expected to do is to understand literary devices used by the author. Actually, literature is distinguished from other forms of writing by a special and creative use of language, and this special use of language is made possible by numerous literary devices. Here are some examples. When we read individual literary texts, we will look at them and understand them. Here we have just explained what these major literary devices are. Metaphor deals with implicit comparison, while simile tells us about explicit comparison. A kind of metaphor is personification, where we attribute human qualities to things which don't have life. Repetition is a common feature in literature which is available in different forms, like anaphora at the beginning, antistrophe at the end of a line, refrain. In any novel or drama or poetry, the same line can be repeated at any point of time. We have two kinds of exaggeration. Literature, remember, tells us about ideal life and also actual life. So it can also go below this. That's where we have hyperbole and lightheadedness, that is over exaggeration or under exaggeration. A typical feature of literature is irony, paradox, oxymoron. This refers to self-contradiction in different ways. And another common feature is rhetorical question. It is a question with an answer within itself. We will have lots of examples when we look at the literary pieces themselves. This course is all about literature and life. Life is all about human relationships. So in every text that we discuss, we will focus on human relationships as well, because literature is all about complex human relationships between the individual and the whole world. Relationship with the self, which may be real or illusory, that's what we have to understand. Similarly, relationship with people. People means within the family or within the neighborhood or some friends, in the workplace or in different places, all about human relationships. We will focus on them. Whatever kinds of relationship we find, we will highlight them. And one more relationship is relationship with God. We can relate ourselves to God, nature, animals, plants, and find some meaning. You will be surprised to see that some people spend their time only for animals or plants apart from human beings, and there are some others we spend our whole lifetime with machines, gadgets, objects. People love their cars or machines like mobile phones or watches even, and they relate themselves to such lifeless objects and find some meaning. Whatever form of relationship we have, whether they are human beings or natural objects or mechanical objects, man-made objects, what is important for us to understand is the quality of relationship, whether it is trust or betrayal, generosity, meanness, kindness, cruelty. Apart from all these things, there is another thing called apathetic relationship. That is, the person is indifferent or unconcerned about anything. That is considered to be one of the dangerous forms of life for us. Either way, either we are in trust or we don't have trust, but if we are indifferent about human beings or our life, that is not good for us. So we have to analyze ourselves when we read literature and understand who we are, what kind of feeling that we have about ourselves and the rest of the world. To read literature and the relationship between life and literature is excellent for us, very useful for us to reflect on what life means. So any study of literary text invites some questions about life. So what are the questions that we are going to discuss? What kind of life, what kind of meaning is presented in this text? What kind of social organization is good for human beings and other forms of life? How can we make meaning out of life? What practices can we follow and what practices can we avoid? How can we understand ourselves in relation to others and the larger society, including nature? That's a serious theme today in our life. Climate change, environmental degradation or destruction, that is a serious problem we consider today. Such reflective questions can help us in understanding life, ourselves and others around us, so that we can live a meaningful life. That is one of the major goals of this course. How can we find meaning in our life? By reading literature. We can have a personal response to literature. It is possible for us. What does a text mean for me as an individual? It may have a general meaning for everybody, but what does it mean for me? And similarly, we can ask ourselves, what does a text do to me? And there are many readers who have expressed themselves. They have blogs, they have letters, diaries, where they describe how some literature or how some literary piece influenced them. How do I feel about myself after reading a text or watching a drama? What emotions does a text create in me? Do we feel happy or do we feel unhappy, or do we feel angry? Do we feel depressed? All these questions if we ask, it will be good for us to understand ourselves. How do I feel about the world around me after reading the text? Some people, they say the world is a good place to live. Some others think the world is not at all a good place to live. Why do they form such opinions? That is because of their own experience. What is presented in literature, we can connect ourselves with such experiences. How does any idea or image or phrase appeal to me specially? Some quotations, some words, they always attract us. How do they attract us? What do they mean for us? We can ask ourselves. How does a text help me sharpen my perception of life, perception of people, and then how do I develop my capacity or capability to live my life in my own way? Whatever may happen around me, how do I live my life? We can analyze ourselves in response to the literary text. How can I understand myself better with the given text? How can I understand others too, if possible? How do I relate to the experience presented in the text? How would I behave in such situations as the characters are? We come across many characters in different situations. How will I behave in such situations? We can also find out certain weaknesses that we may have by reading such books. What areas of improvement can I identify in myself? How can I help myself live a meaningful life? This is a question that we have been repeating again and again. How can I write about my own experiences in a text of my own so that I can leave the text for posterity, for readers in the future? They will appreciate, they will feel happy to read our own experiences if we write about our own experiences. And to write about our own experiences, if we read more about others' experiences, it will be good training for us. We will also adopt wherever possible a comparative approach. For example, T.S. Eliot says comparison and analysis are the tools of the critic. The critic here is a reader. A well-trained reader becomes a good critic. We will compare one text with another text because it is useful to us. What are the various ways in which we can compare? We can compare the characters, themes, techniques, language and style, the worldview presented in a particular text. A comparison of Girish Karnad's Tughlaq with Karnad's own play, The Dreams of Tipu Sultan, can be very useful because they are historical plays. They deal with the medieval and modern period in Indian history. We can also adopt another comparative approach where we compare the one writing with the writing of another writer from a different country or from the same country. Let's again go back to T.S. Eliot, who says, "No poet, no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone. His significance, his appreciation is the appreciation of his relation to the dead poets and artists. You cannot value him alone. You must set him for contrast and comparison among the dead." So it is always useful for us to adopt a comparative approach. As we mentioned earlier, the comparison can happen in terms of character, theme, language and style and worldview. Here, for example, we can give this example of Girish Karnad's Tughlaq, which we can compare with Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, because they are considered to be absurd plays or existential plays. We can also compare Girish Karnad's play Tughlaq with another play by Indra Parthasarathi called Aurangzeb from Tamil literature, which is also available in English, because Aurangzeb and Tughlaq are part of Indian history. We can understand how they ruled their country and how people lived in that time and how we are related to them and how they are relevant to us even today. This particular aspect of critical interpretations we are not using in our course. However, I have given this slide to understand that there are many ways in which we can approach literature philosophically, looking at the idealism, humanism, spirituality, religion and all other aspects. We can also look at literary text from sociological points of view like race, class, struggles, hierarchy and economic exploitations, and also gender issues. These are very common today, and wherever possible we will touch upon them, but we may not adopt a specific critical approach to any literary piece. And when it comes to psychological approach to literature, we will focus on individuals, their attitudes, their states of mind. One of the common approaches which are used today for study of literature is feminist approach. Through this approach, we deal with the power relations between men and women. And another approach which is common in India is post-colonial approach, because we were once colonized and so we inherit certain experiences of colonization. Here is a good example of a story by Prem Chand. It is called The Resignation. During the Raj time, British Raj time, there was a clerk who was ill-treated by his fellows at that time, and one day he became angry and resigned his job. So because of this hierarchical relationship between the colonized and the colonizer in different forms. We are politically free today, but then the sense of colonized feeling may be there in some people, or it may operate in some indirect ways in us, particularly where we have hierarchical structures which are remnants of the colonized period. What are the takeaways is a big question for us. At the end of every lecture, we will have one slide where we discuss the takeaways. Here we have some examples. Any idea that can be useful for living our life is what we have in this section. For example, when we read Abdul Kalam's essay "When I Failed," we can understand accept your destiny is one takeaway from this essay. Similarly, when we read Chetan Bhagat's essay "My Stupid Suicide Plan," we can understand a great idea. Death is inevitable, but we don't have to kill ourselves. There is no reason for committing suicide. That's a big idea we can carry from this essay. Then when we come to W.H. Davies' poem "Leisure," we understand we should not ignore rest and relaxation. Whatever work we may do, we should find time for rest and also relaxation for ourselves. Then when we read a play like Grish Karnad's Tughlaq, we have to understand human beings are ultimately alone. We may live our life with power, without power, but ultimately we are alone. Finally, when we read a beautiful short story, science fiction story by Isaac Asimov like True Love, we understand never love or arrange your marriage by a deputy. If you arrange a deputy for your marriage, then the deputy may become more important than you and you will lose your lover. So we should not love anybody by a deputy, or we should not arrange a marriage by a deputy. We should do it on our own. This initiative we have to take ourselves is important from this story. To summarize, this whole lecture is all about how we are going to approach the problem of literature and life. We will focus on the biographical approach of the author and their writings, the context in which they wrote. We will focus on the method of reading, close reading, and when we do so, we will focus on literary form, theme, character, language and style, and literary devices. And for this course, we will examine human relationships and reflections of life presented in the text that we deal with. Wherever possible, we will also try to respond personally and do some kind of self-analysis ourselves. As I mentioned earlier, that particular part you have to do it individually. Then we will adopt wherever possible some comparative approach and compare one text with another text by the same author or from different authors. We also suggested that it will be good for us to use some critical approaches wherever possible, and we will not focus too much on these critical approaches because, as we said, it is a general course for everybody, and most importantly this is crucial for us. There are some takeaways from every text. There is a pragmatic use for us in reading literature that we will focus in this particular course and learn as much as possible from the study of literature. We have some references for you in the next slide. You can explore the relationship between literature and life in your own way and adopt a new approach on your own. This is what I found useful. I have shared it with you. In the next week's lectures, we will focus on the elements of literature and then we will take up literary pieces individually. All the best. Thank you.